Well, it's great to have Binary Australia spokeswoman Kirralie Smith with me today. Kirralie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lyle.
And Kirralie, we're now live to our live stream audience, but for those who are watching the podcast, which drops later this week, you and I have just watched the excellent video that Binary produced last week, featuring a number of prominent detransitioners, people who have had gender confusion and had surgery, radical alterations of their body, and then have spoken out about the harms that have done. And that included people like Chloe Cole, who did a media conference last week with the US Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, and also Keira Bell, probably the world's most famous detransitioner, who helped shut down the Tavistock Child Gender Clinic in London. Kirralie, that was an awesome piece of work. Tell us about what you're seeing in Binary and the opportunity that there has been through the bravery of these detransitioners to feature their stories in the way that you've done.
Yeah, look, it's really hard to watch. I find it really hard to watch that video. It's very emotional watching. Particularly, it's so common now for women who, as teenage girls, were sold the lie that they didn't belong in the body that they were born in and have undertaken the most drastic measures. And in the case of the video, these girls were taking hormones. Sorry for my dog. Taking hormones that deepen their voice, give them facial hair, and most of them also had a double mastectomy, which is a very serious surgery. And all of those things are irreversible. And they were sold the lie on a couple of consultations with a gender clinic and told that you could have these cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, and surgery. Most of it's reversible, and you won't have any regrets. And they've gone into it at a time in their life where they were already, all of them talk about they were experiencing either some form of trauma, they might be on the spectrum, they've had some sort of abuse or something happen in their life with mental health issues and depression, that those are the issues that should have been addressed and were not in every single case. They were led down this affirmation only pathway, which affirms nothing. It affirms a fantasy, basically. And these women are now tragically left for the rest of their life. And Chloe Cole says it so well, doesn't even know if she's going to be able to have children, doesn't know what the lifelong effects are going to be, and nor do the doctors. So it's just a tragedy unfolding, and these brave women who are speaking out. Oh, and my heart breaks for them, Lyle, but at the same time, I'm cheering them on and saying thank you so much. And hopefully there'll be some young girls and guys who watch these videos and think twice about the pathways that they're on.
Yeah, look, as you say, it is very confronting to watch a young woman who has lost her breasts, wondering whether she is going to be able to carry a child in the future, trouble emptying her bladder, all of these sort of terrible, horrific side effects from so-called gender affirmation treatment. And your video features an Australian, Dr. Michelle Telfer, who is one of the most prominent proponents of transitioning children. She's at the Royal Children's Hospital here in Melbourne, where I'm currently based on assignment for the Victorian election at the moment. She's quite openly saying this is all fine for kids, and yet we've got these stories now coming out almost on a weekly basis. What is happening in this country that our politicians are still allowing this, as we're seeing child gender clinics shut down in London and in Northern Europe, and questioning of this approach all around the world, yet here in Australia, our politicians are still allowing children to be experimented on.
It's absolutely mind-boggling and beyond comprehension that this is happening. There are very few, basically no long-term studies of the effects of these puberty blockers, let alone this cross-sex hormones and everything else. They're using them off-label. So puberty blockers were designed just for a very specific short window of time for children with precocious puberty. So they're like 8, 9, 10 years old. But now they're being prescribed to teenagers for a very long amount of time. Dr. Dylan Wilson, a paediatric specialist in Queensland, has written an open letter to GPs saying don't send kids to gender clinics, particularly like the Melbourne one, where they will be put on these affirmation-only pathways. And the harm that is done, we already know that it can result in genitals don't grow, so there's no sexual function as adults. It can cause sterility. They can and do. And in that video, I think Michelle Tefler says there's bone density issues, and there's also brain development issues. So these are very serious consequences. They're not something that we should take lightly. And it is time for gender clinics in Australia to undergo a very rigorous and very thorough investigation. There needs to be some federal inquiries into these practices. Doctors and medical healthcare professionals have been threatened with, cancellation and insults and abuse when they speak out about these things. But thankfully, there is a growing number of the medical professionals who are saying, hang on a minute, this is not right. This can't continue down this pathway. And as you mentioned, the UK has had to shut down their clinics because of Kirralie. Sweden, Finland, and some other countries are really seriously reassessing or pausing altogether these treatments for under 18-year-olds. Adults, again, can go down this pathway if that's what they choose. But we have seen that adults who have gone down this pathway really had no idea of the implications and the side effects anyway. So it needs to be stopped. It needs to be stopped right now. There needs to be an inquiry.
Yeah, and it's a failure of our mainstream media that they are not putting a microphone in front of people like Premier Dan Andrews here in Victoria and saying, well, Tavistock has closed down in the UK because a paediatrician, Dr. Hilary Cass, recommended that it shut down and they stopped giving puberty blockers to kids. And yet we are still prescribing all this here at the Royal Women's Children Hospital here in Melbourne. It's a massive failure. Why do you think this is? Why do you think the media are so incurious when there's so much evidence from overseas of the harms, experts coming out, action being taken by politicians overseas, and yet here, nothing?
Yeah, look, I think there's several things. One, it's just become so politicized, which is utterly ridiculous. This is children's lives that we're talking about. And this is an issue that isn't left or right politics. This is not, it's not even, they want to now make it about, well, it's lesbian or feminism or right-wing Christian or whatever. It's not. This is simply about the health and well-being of children. And that's what it should be about. Medical principles have, in this country have usually been really of high standard, and there has to be very rigorous studies. There has to be evidence. It has to go through a lot of protocols. And it all seems to have been thrown out the window because it was politicized and because the Anti-Discrimination Act took biological sex out of the Sex Discrimination Act. So there's no protections for sex in the Sex Discrimination Act. And now everyone's really afraid of falling foul of this Anti-Discrimination Act. And so few people are willing to speak out. They don't want to risk their careers. They don't want to risk their ability to practice medicine. And so instead of standing up and speaking out, too many of them are just passing the buck to these gender clinics that are 100% politicized. And unfortunately, the media, as we know, are so captured by that progressive thinking, it's regressive. It's all about reinforcing stereotypes and really rigid stereotypes at that. And again, none of those publications, well, very few of the publications, I should say, are prepared to speak what is right. They just go along with the ideology, that political agenda, and instead of questioning it, as you said, they either ignore it or they reinforce the agenda because they want to be seen as progressive.
Yep, no, that's right. And it's almost like the horse has really bolted on this, particularly here in Victoria, but in other states. You and I have both been highlighting the Victorian Education Department website, which tells teachers that if a child wants to transition at school and doesn't want their parents to know, the teachers must hide that information from their parents. And I've indeed spoken to a grandmother who has a daughter here in Victoria whose transition was hidden from her parents for months and months because of this policy.
Yeah, we hear absolute horror stories of what's going on around the country, Lyle, where, the first thing some parents are hearing is when, police turn up at the door and take the child into, um, some sort of foster care or care because the child has said the parents won't let them transition and the parents don't even know what's going on. So these laws are out of control. They have completely usurped parental authority and rights. Things are happening without parental knowledge or consent. Children's well-being and health are being put at risk, all for this political agenda, and it's ridiculous. There is no way that the state can parent children better than families can. There is just so few rare exceptions where that would be the case, and this has all happened without most of the public aren't aware of it. They just don't know what these laws are. I know with the education policy in Victoria, we polled several thousand Victorians, and many of them were in Mulgrave, in Dan Andrews' seat. We asked them, were they aware that this policy exists, that schools could transition children without parental knowledge or consent? Less than 30% actually were aware of it. Once they were made aware, we asked them, would you be opposed or in support of that policy? And almost 90% was strongly opposed to that
There you
policy.
go, in Dan Andrews' own electorate. Wow. Yeah.
Exactly.
No,
exactly.
It's exciting. Look, if people just knew the truth, we know that they would vote out politicians who support this rubbish. We've seen this week in Italy, and I wanted to get your comments on the new Italian Prime Minister. I'm going to get her name wrong. I think it's Giorgia Meloni. My Italian is very, very bad, but she has caused an absolute stir. They're calling her a fascist. They're calling her far right wing. But watching her videos online, she stands up for the family. She stands up for the truth about gender. If only Australian politicians would say out loud the sort of things that she has said, and she's been rewarded at the ballot box. What do you think that tells our politicians?
Oh, look, I think they're all deaf and dumb, to be quite honest. Well, most of them are. There's a few shining lights in there. But yes, I don't know much about her. I've only seen her this week. And as you said, some of those videos are so refreshing to hear somebody talk about all of the identity issues and stand up for common sense. She's just plain speaking. It is so refreshing. And I and many others obviously are celebrating the example that she's setting. But again, I've talked to lots of politicians, many of them, in private behind closed doors are, oh, yes, we're all for you. We agree. But, either they're afraid of the Anti-Discrimination Act or they're in opposition and feel like they don't have that ability to speak out, which I don't know what you're opposing if you can't speak out against what the government's doing. But there are some rare voices. But, we see things like, Bernie Finn, when he speaks up for pro-life and these sort of issues, he gets kicked out of these parties. So it's really frustrating, Lyle. I don't know what it's going to take to turn it around, other than we just have to keep trying. We have to keep voicing these things. We have to keep speaking the truth and hope that pendulum has almost finished its arc and is about to swing back, because it's too much damage is being done in the meantime.
Oh, I think the arc is going to swing back. The tide is turning. We're seeing that all around the world. Kirralie, thank you so much for your time today. I know that your voice is very much appreciated by all of us in the work of Binary, and I'd encourage everyone to go to binary.org.au. I think it's the correct website, and check out Kirralie's work there. But thanks for your time today, Kirralie. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lyle.